Hi everyone. This class is the third in the series, and I love context. Context is everything. So every segment of not just Jewish education, but education in general, very, very often is missing context. And when you don't have context, you're like, okay, I'm going to learn it, but why is it important? I remember coming to algebra and trigonometry class in high school, and not having context, like, okay, now we're going to learn trigonometry. What is trigonometry? Why will I ever use it? Why is it important? Give me some real life scenarios where this is going to happen. The same thing can be even said for chemistry or biology. None of these things were in context. Why is it important that this is true? And context is everything. So in Judaism, there is context that's missing, even if you have been to Jewish school and Jewish class and Jewish camp or went to Sunday school. There's context that's missing, which is actually troubling. So for example, Passover. Okay, I eat the matzah, but did the events happen that we're celebrating? Do I even believe in God that supposedly took the Jewish people out of Egypt? There are so many questions. So instead, what we do is we put our fingers in our ears and we say, la, 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 la. Don't give me, just give me the matzah. Let me sing the Manishtana and I'm going to be good. And don't give me any troubling questions that may shake up my faith. And I was never that kind of person, and neither are my kids. Like, I want to know that it's true, that it's real, that it's historically based. I need to know, because not just because I don't want to be doing things that are just meaningless because I have OCD, but the opposite. I want them to be more meaningful. I'm trying to build the case for Judaism. So if you were in my first class, then you would have heard the case for a creator versus chaos. That there is a creator, that the world is premeditated, it is designed by a designer, versus the world quantum fluctuating into existence with all of the intricacies and interlocking design and so on. We built a case. Last class that we gave, we built the second case. And that second case is, okay, I get it. So there's a creator. There's a reasonable way of understanding there's a creator. But how do I know that the creator wanted us to practice Judaism? Maybe the creator was into Christianity or Islam or Baha'i or Taoism or Hinduism or Buddhism. How do I know that Judaism got it right? After all, we're tiny compared to Muslims or Christians. We're a small little people. So why would I suspect that we got it right and the rest of the world did not? Or to some degree they did not. We are now up to a little more technical, but I think no less interesting, okay? And that is rabbis, rabbinical Judaism, and maybe the fidelity of the Torah itself. What do I mean? So, starting off this class, I want to take the following items as a given. Okay, because we have these two other classes. Ready for this? Item number 1, that there's a creator. Item number 2, that the Jewish people left Egypt, stood around Mount Sinai, and received Torah, or 10 Commandments. We have to get into the weeds what exactly they received. But here we are, 3,300 years later, or exactly, if you were listening last week, exactly 3,333 years later, 3333, that's this year is a very interesting year because it's the 3333 year. This year, how do I know that the Torah that we received then is the Torah that we have today? Maybe it's evolved, maybe it's changed. That's not an unreasonable supposition. Things change over time, isn't that correct? And then, outside of Torah itself, there's all these extra laws that are attributed to oral law or rabbinic Judaism. How do I know that that's even part of the transmission? So those are two incredibly important questions, and we're going to cover them, and I think you're going to enjoy this. So question number one, why isn't Judaism something like broken telephone? And I'll explain to you why this question is a very valid question. Within Judaism, there is the written Torah that we all have copies of, we've all seen, perhaps we've touched, perhaps we made a blessing by it. That's the written Torah. And then there's another Torah. There's a completely another Torah. It's called oral Torah, known in Hebrew as Torah Shebaal Peh. Now, the truth is you all have heard of it, you just may not know that it is oral Torah. We're going to get into that. You've heard of it, but you haven't heard the words oral law be designated for the practice, but that's really what it is. So let's begin with the written Torah. So the oldest written Torahs that we have are how old? So the oldest complete written Torah is 2,000 years old. Now that's very old. That's from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We don't have older Torahs because the law is that when a Torah gets old, when the letters begin to crumble, we don't keep that Torah around because the Torah has laws in it. And letters crumble and we read from it, instead of it saying, lo signov, don't steal, what would happen if the word lo, which means don't, what would happen if that word got crumbled and erased? So how would it read? Steal, kill. So we have a law. The law is that if a Torah gets very old, we don't keep that Torah around. We take that Torah and we bury it. So by its nature, we're not going to have a lot of ancient Torahs. Ancient Torahs get buried. So why do we even have any ancient Torahs at all? And the answer is because in the times of the Second Temple, there were a group of people called the Essenes, and they lived right by Masada, actually. And they lived in a city or area called the Qumran, right by the Dead Sea. And they were an interesting group. You could do your research about them. They were a very separatist kind of group, and they had some very odd practices. But they did have a very extensive library. And eventually they died out. They didn't believe in marriage so much, so that doesn't, they didn't procreate, and therefore they died out pretty quickly. But we found their library. Actually, a Bedouin shepherd found their library by accident. A goat had jumped far away out of reach of this young Bedouin shepherd, and he ended up jumping into one of these caves in the Qumran, and the shepherd couldn't reach this goat, so he takes a rock and he throws it into the cave to scare the goat out. And the goat heard, and the shepherd heard like a cracking sound, a crashing sound, and he says, wow, what was that? I threw a rock into the cave that was above me, and it broke something. And he was curious enough that he was able to scale his way up to this cave, and he came and he found all of these pottery jars with rolled up scrolls. And those scrolls ended up being called the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're incredibly famous. They are arguably the most famous archaeological find, at least man-made find, in the history of the world. There's never been anything like that. Normally, scrolls like those would have been buried if they were Jewish, and even secular, they would have fallen apart. But because the area in the Dead Sea is so dry and arid, they were preserved. And they were brought down, and it's this tremendous intrigue with these scrolls. But at the end of the day, the scrolls were brought to Israel, and they live next to the Israel Museum in a building called the Shrine of the Book. So the oldest Torah is 2,000 years old. However, if our Torah is 3,300 years old, that still gives the Torah 1,300 years to change. Typos, right? You ever type? You have a typo. What if there's a typo? And it's a very reasonable question. And remember, Torah, where every single word can change the meaning, maybe there are typos. And especially that it was all handwritten. And when you write something in hand and you're copying from another scroll, it's very, very likely that a letter or two got messed up here and there. And if you want to understand how likely it is, how many versions are there of the New Testament? Anyone have any idea? If you conclude that every letter that is different creates a new version, which is what both the new Christians and Jews would say when it comes to a holy work. When it comes to a holy work, if you have a difference in letter, specifically if that difference in a letter changes the meaning, then you have a new book. How many differences are there in the New Testament? The answer is 300,000. There are so many differences. And don't forget, the New Testament is much more recent than the Torah. The New Testament was written in 70, 80 CE, Common Era, and that's when it started being written by Paul. And then it was written over a period of 50 years. So, right, then there's other tomes that were not included, the Gnostic, but in general, it's 2,000 years newer, and yet there are so many mistakes in it. And the New Testament is not as big as the Torah. They call it the Old Testament. I don't like to call it Old Testament because it's not only that, it's just Torah. It's only old if there's a new one, but we don't believe the new is real. We say it's baloney, and therefore the Torah is the Torah, period. The Torah is 2/5 larger than the entire New Testament. So something that's larger has more room for error, right? The larger the book, more room for error. The older it is, the more room for error. And if there's 300,000 discrepancies in the New Testament, how many discrepancies should we find in the Torah? So I'm going to tell you something that is fascinating. In the entire world, whether you go to an Ashkenazi country, a Sephardic country, you can go to Tunisia, you can go to Eilat, you can go to Denmark, Sweden, Buenos Aires. In the entire Torah, you will only find one letter difference between Ashkenaz and Sfarad in the entire Torah. Not 300,000, one letter. One letter. And that letter, by the way, doesn't change the meaning. How did that happen? How did they get it so wrong and Judaism was able to keep the fidelity there? So there's a lot of explanations why. Number one, if there is a mistake, then the Torah can't be used. Remember I said if a letter is crumbled, you can't use that Torah? So too, if there's a mistake in the Torah, you can't use that Torah. As a matter of fact, if you've ever seen a Torah, when you close the Torah, there's a belt around it, and then there's a cover. You've seen that before? A belt inside, cover outside. If there's a Torah that has one letter error, the belt goes on the outside of the Torah on top of the cover to signify that it is unusable Torah, and you're not allowed to keep that Torah even in your house. So, Torahs, there is this understanding that it must be kept as pure and as clean and as real as possible. If you look in history, there were actually 6 discrepancies, but 5 of them got wiped out very quickly. The reason there were discrepancies at all is because, remember, Jews are a very small population, and when we were exiled very often, we were exiled very quickly. Imagine the Jews in Ukraine right now. Get out of here, get out of here. So they were exiled quickly. There was a lot of this came before there was ever printed work. So you have to make sure when you were exiled that you had a Torah of good standing, that the fidelity is accurate. And there were so many little hamlets that the Jews ended up in that there were times where there was not a single Torah available. Now we look at that like a crazy thing. If I showed you, I have a cupboard right here. I have 3 Torahs sitting right here in the cupboard. But in those days, it was it was possible. But what ended up happening was the Torahs were always cross-checked with each other. So when there was a mistake in the Torah, because scribes do make mistakes, it was cross-referenced to many other Torahs, and it was able to be fixed. Today, by the way, when a Torah is written, besides being hand-checked, not once but twice, it is also computer-checked. So it's actually a computer program, and Torahs today are computer-checked, like rolls by and can scan it and see if there's any mistakes. I think that's very cool. It's a great use of technology to computer-check a Torah. So that's Torah. So the fidelity of the Torah is incredibly important in Judaism, and the great rabbis were actually called sofrim. A sofer, people translate as a scribe, but a sofer also means a counter, somebody who counts, because these sofrim would count every single letter. They knew exactly how many letters there were in the Torah. There's over 300,000 letters in the Torah, and they would count each one of those letters, and they knew if the Torah was missing even one letter. So as far as Torah goes, fascinating, but the fidelity is accurate wherever you go in the world. Not only that, my friends, but Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, for all their differences, they all got the same Torah. All the same. Really interesting. Okay, now you've got the written Torah. Now, let me just give you a little background. So when was the written Torah given? So there are a few opinions, but let me just give you the basic opinion, okay? At Mount Sinai, we received the 10 Commandments, right? God speaking to the Jewish people. According to one opinion, God gave the first 2. It was too dramatic for the Jewish people to hear God speak, so they asked Moshe to give the other 8. According to other opinions, God gave the entire 10. Either way, the Jewish people heard God speak. Whether it was 2 or 10, it became clear, and we spoke about that last week. Over the next 40 years, the Jewish people were in the desert. God would give Moshe the Torah, and Moshe would then teach it to the Jewish people. How did the Jewish people know that the Torah that Moshe was giving came from God? Maybe the Jewish people would say, hey, first 10 heard from God at Mount Sinai on that day. But Torah is big. So why wouldn't they suspect maybe Moshe just added all sorts of laws to the Torah? That's a good question also, right? A good question? How do they know? The answer is, when God gave the Torah at Mount Sinai, he did it in a very unique way. And I can quote the verse. Verse says, I'll quote the Hebrew than the English. Vayomer Hashem Moshe, God said to Moshe, God says to Moses, Hine anochi ba'elecha ba'av ha'anan. Behold, I will appear to you in the thickness of a cloud. And we're not talking about a cloud like the kind that holds water. It's called the Anan HaKavod, a holy cloud. This was a cloud the Jewish people were very familiar with. The Torah speaks about it quite often. It led the Jewish people through the desert. And God comes down in the thickness of a cloud, so that the nation will see that I'm speaking to you, that God's speaking to Moshe, and then in you they will believe forever. Meaning the following, God says, listen, I'm not going to stay at Mount Sinai and teach 613 commandments. Way too dramatic. No one's going to remember it. You'll have questions. Learning Torah takes a long time. So I'm going to give you the ultimate teacher. His name is Moses. Moshe. He is the teacher. But how do you know he's not ad-libbing? And the answer is, God says, I'm going to give the Torah, the 10 Commandments, to Moshe, and you're going to see us communicate through this Anan HaKavod, through this special cloud. And then from then on, when you see the tabernacle, which followed the Jewish people in the desert, when you would see that same cloud that was on top of Mount Sinai descend on the tabernacle, and you would see Moshe walk in, you knew that we were having communication. And that is what happened over the next 40 years. Moshe would walk in the tent of glory, this tabernacle, the cloud would descend, and everyone said, there is communication going on. The cloud would lift up, and the Jewish people left. There was never a disagreement about that. Everyone saw it, and it was one of those miracles. The cloud of glory in general is a miracle that is actually more substantiated than any miracle in the history of miracles. Why is that? Okay, we're going to take a moment and explain what makes a miracle a miracle. Christians say they have miracles, Muslims say they have miracles. What makes a miracle a miracle? That's a fair question. Everyone makes claims to miracles. So, normally speaking, when someone thinks something is supernatural, it's not. Because science explains many things. And there were things that people thought were supernatural for thousands of years, and now we understand how they work. Right? I don't know, maybe the Northern Lights. They would say the gods are speaking. Like there are things that were not well understood. Today we understand. It's static in the environment, but people didn't understand. So what makes a miracle a miracle? So I'm going to give you a few criteria where the more criteria a miracle fulfills, the more substantial and substantiated a miracle is. Okay? And this is a great exercise. And if you ever have friends, I saw a miracle, say, one second, let's look at the criteria and see whether this actually lines up. Number one, was the miracle predicted? Was it predicted? Predicting something in advance makes the event much more substantial. I'll give you an example. Let's say I go to China and I miss my plane. I end up staying in Hong Kong for the night. I come down to breakfast and there is my old friend from high school, maybe my best friend I hadn't seen in 20 years, and we are sitting right across from each other. What are the chances that happened? What are the chances that I happen to be in China, the first time I ever went, I happen to miss my plane, what are the chances that I am bumping into my friend over here? And the answer is the chances are actually quite good. Why? Because it wasn't predicted. So if it wasn't predicted, then the chances are not, what are the chances of me bumping into my friend in China? The real question is, what are the chances of a random event occurring or a coincidence occurring? And the answer is very high. Coincidences occur all the time. It doesn't do anything. Like when there's no coincidence, it doesn't register because nothing happened. So when a coincidence happens, I say, wow, that's interesting. But coincidences happen all the time in our lives. What would have made this a much more fascinating occurrence is if 20 years ago, when we were best friends in high school, I predicted on this day and this time, we are going to end up in China and I'm going to miss my plane. And okay, that's already really interesting. But if it wasn't predicted in advance, then it was just a coincidence, and the chance of coincidences occurring are very common. So something has to be predicted. That already takes away a lot of miracles. Something happens all of a sudden, right? Something's predicted in advance. So for example, when the Jews received the Torah, God said, you're going to hear me in 3 days, prepare yourself. So it was predicted. The clouds of glory were predicted beforehand. So was the manna. Okay, another issue with miracles is if a miracle happens only one time. Because if something happens one time, it's never repeated, then, okay, something happened. Like, I don't know what to make of that. Like, well, that was quick. That was, wow. I don't know what, maybe that was a miracle. Maybe it wasn't. But imagine if something repeated itself, a miraculous event, but it happened again and again. That's much more substantial. Okay, so the more something repeats itself, because otherwise something happened and I can't explain it, but you can't duplicate it. So maybe it's some science thing, or maybe it was prepared, like, I don't know. It was a one-time occurrence. Okay, we agree with that? The more often it repeats itself, the more substantial it is. I'll give you another problem with miracles. Sometimes miracles happen in a moment of great stress, a moment of great duress, which means that I'm in a lot of stress and suddenly something happens like, oh my goodness. But I don't know, was it my mind playing tricks on me? I'm locked in an elevator and I can't get out, and all of a sudden something happens and like I banged twice and suddenly the elevator goes, was my banging? When things happen and I'm stressed, I often misread what happened and how it happened and what it means. But if I'm calm, like in Hebrew, I'm sababa, I'm just relaxed. And then something occurs, wow, that's really substantial. Wow, I was relaxed. I was prepared for it. It's happening repeatedly. I'll give you another issue. What if a miracle happens to one person? It's better, like we said last week, if the miracle happens to multiple people. Something happens to multiple people, then it's a lot more substantial. When a miracle occurs to many people, then I could say, wow, you could fool one person, you could fool a few people, but if it happened to many people, that's more exciting. There was a fellow who said to me, Rabbi, what do you say about that statue of a cow in India? I said, I don't know, what are you talking about? He said, yeah, there was this cow in India that began to, it was a cow idol, and it began to bleed milk from its eyes. And pilgrims came and they saw the cow bleeding milk from its eyes, and they bowed down and they gave gifts and they prostrated themselves. What do you say about that? The cow bleeding milk from its eyes, that's a miracle. Hindu. I said, okay, I have a question for you. Okay, let's say this idol cow is bleeding milk. What obligation did that cause the people who saw it? What did it obligate them to do? Nothing. They just saw it and they were very impressed. They were blown away. Yeah, but what if somebody said to them, if this cow really is miraculous, that would prove to you Hinduism is true, and now please give all your money to the temple. Or please circumcise yourself. Or please, I don't know, maybe there's got to be another explanation to this. Maybe there's condensation that's causing what looks like milk. Maybe there's a guy inside who made little holes by the eyes, drip dropping milk. Meaning, a miracle that doesn't create obligation is not so impressive. Because we all want to be impressed by things we can't explain. But if being impressed comes at a cost, I'm going to be much more skeptical. So almost every miracle that exists outside of Judaism falls short in one or many of these categories. And that's why, in Christianity, to be called a saint, there have to be two witnesses. Each witness has to say that this person, like Mother Teresa was called a saint in Catholicism, there have to be two people that saw her do a miracle. Yeah, but I didn't know those two people are accurate. It happened to one person, one time, without forewarning. It didn't create any kind of obligation. It may have happened on duress, I don't know. But these are very, very weak miracles. There was a very famous story on eBay. Someone was selling the face of Jesus in toast. Like they put a grilled cheese sandwich in, and somehow when it came out, it burnt in a way that looked like the face of Jesus. Now, between you, I, and the lamppost, even if Jesus existed, which I'm not going to concede. I mean, there are a lot of scholars say it was an amalgamation of different personalities. It's a good cause to say that. But even if a guy Jesus existed, does anyone know what he looked like? Anyone? No. Because our image of Jesus comes from Leonardo da Vinci, correct? That's how our image comes from. He was probably not white, probably didn't have long hair. He looks like a Caucasian from Denmark. He probably looked dark. And so, yeah, but the Leonardo da Vinci version came out on the French toast, on the grilled cheese, and then they sold it on eBay for a lot of money. That's a miracle? Was that predicted in advance? Did that create obligation? You know, it didn't happen under duress, but someone stood to make a buck. Most miracles that are out there are easily explained away, easily. So in Judaism, we don't do anything with that. We don't do anything. I'll give you one more Christian example. You know, I like to pick on my Christian brothers, but I don't. Just intellectually, the rising of Lazarus in the New Testament. Lazarus' sister comes to Jesus and says, "My brother died." Where is he? He's in this cave. Jesus says, "Go gather people." People came outside the cave. She says, "My brother died, he's in the cave." Everyone waited outside, and then a few minutes later, Jesus comes out with a risen Lazarus. Did anyone see he was actually dead? Right? It was a little hokey pokey, right? The people saw him dead. Was there a doctor who took his pulse, declared him brain dead? They stood outside the cave. He come out victorious with a risen Lazarus. Come on. Maybe 2,000 years ago that did something, but today, you know, we've actually seen people who did come back from clinical death. We know such a thing exists. We're not sure how, why, what, where, when, but no one saw him except for his sister who said she was dead. Who said he was dead? Maybe she was lying and Jesus thought that he made Lazarus rise. Meaning these miracles, they don't mean anything. Let me contrast that to a very simple miracle that the Jews claim. Very simple miracle. When the Jews were in the desert, they couldn't plant. First of all, they were moving from area to area. But not only were they moving, but it was a desert. So they didn't have lots and lots of livestock, or they didn't have lots and lots of produce and wheat and grain and apples. So what did they eat? So they ate something called the mun, or known in English as the manna. Have you heard of manna from heaven? It means God prepared a kind of food and put it for each Jewish person, and every one of them ate the manna for 40 years. And it became like part of their natural day-to-day. You'd come outside, you'd find your manna waiting, you'd bring it in and cook it up, and that would sustain an entire nation. Now, I gotta tell you something about this manna miracle. That's a heck of a miracle. It actually checks off every single box. It happened multiple times, to many people, not under duress. It was forewarned. It did create obligation, actually, because the laws of manna were connected to the laws of Shabbat. It didn't fall on Shabbat. So it obligated them to keep Shabbat and to rely on the fact that it's going to fall twice on Friday. The manna is one of the strongest miracles in the history of miracles. Christians don't deny this, by the way. It's not denied, and I don't think Muslims do either. I didn't look into, but Muslims do believe in the general story of the Torah. That's a very big statement that the manna is a miracle that checks off all the boxes. It's not the only one. Clouds of glory were also like that. Now, certain miracles in Judaism don't check off all the boxes. It doesn't mean they're not accurate. Splitting of the sea does not check off all the boxes because it was a one-time event. Thank God, right? They went through. It also did happen under duress. But it was forewarned because God told Moshe, tell them to walk in. They're going to be okay. It did happen to many people. It was witnessed by many people. It did create obligation. So not every miracle is going to check off every box. But enough miracles in Judaism do check off the boxes that they can reflect on those that don't. One more thing about miracles. In Judaism, a miracle is not the end-all be-all. As a matter of fact, believe it or not, in Judaism, we downplay miracles. There's no obligation for someone to be a miracle worker to be a great person. You don't have to do hocus pocus. Hashem had to do miracles when the Jewish people left Egypt. That was really important, very important. But he had to save us. But at a certain point, miracles happen when they have to happen. How do you say miracle in Hebrew? The word miracle is nes. And a nes just means a banner or a flag. A banner or a flag. Why is it called a banner or a flag? What about nes is a banner or a flag? So here's how to look at it. In the olden days when people went to war, so war was a bloody enterprise. You'd have one side, picture the Americans and the British, that's sort of an example, right? The Revolutionary War. You'd have one side with their bayonets and their guns and their swords, and they were led by their generals. And then on the other side, you had the same thing. Bayonets, guns, muskets, swords, their generals, and they were very gentlemanly about it. And then they would say, charge, let's go. And then the two sides would clash, and it would then be a nightmare. It would be a horrific hellscape. People would just be sliced and diced and bleeding, blood spritzing, and it was just horrific to look at. And everyone whose uniforms were so beautiful and gold buttons and shiny, and they shined their boots, within a matter of moments, they were in utter despair. There's no glory in war, just bitterness and sadness. And people would be trampled by horses. People would be stabbed. It was just horrific. Now, imagine somebody, they go running into this battle, and in the middle of this battle, which is so fierce, they're on the ground, let's say it had just rained, and they're full of mud, and there's mud everywhere, there's blood everywhere, there's dead carcasses everywhere, and the person gets up, and they're a young guy, they're 18 years old, they don't want to die, and they look around, and everyone's stabbing each other, and people are moving on the ground, the death throes, and then this person says, you know what? I need to be with my people. I need to gather together and figure out where my group is. I can't fight this alone. Problem is, his group is in battle, and they're on the ground, they're muddy, and he doesn't know where they are. So they used to have a flag or a banner, and it was in the rear, it was behind the groups that had charged, and it was raised high. And when you would lose your battalion, they would rally around the flag. They would run back to the flag, and then everyone full of mud and dirt and blood, they'd come rallying around the flag. Now there's a bunch of people that are around the flag. They create a group, and then together, as a unit, they go back into battle. So that's how it used to work. You'd run in, everything would be chaotic. The person would be there, oh no, I lost my group, I can't battle alone. Run back to the flag, other people come running to the flag, soon you got 10, 15, 20 people, and then together, let's go, and then they charge back in. So the flag is the way that everyone knows that, okay, I'm here, we're here, this is where we are. It reminds everyone, or tells everyone that here, we're present, we are, this is where we exist. When God does a miracle, he doesn't do it for the wow factor. Wow, what a miracle, wow. Once in a while, God will change nature to raise a banner, to raise a flag saying, hey, I know life is chaotic now. I know things look terrible, but here I am. Just rally around me, and then you can go on with life. So the flag, the nace, the banner, serves the same purpose as a banner in war. It reminds us in our most difficult time period, that the Almighty is still around, still watching. Now, sometimes that miracle could seem coincidental, and it could be chalked up to coincidence. It could be. Mathematically speaking, coincidences happen, even far-flung ones. What we do is we try to look at them in a way to say, you know what? My faith does not depend on this flag, but it is certainly good. It's certainly comforting to know that God is there, He's watching, and He's got me. And I think for today, we're going to do part B, because we didn't even touch on proper rabbinic Judaism. So we're going to do that part B next week. For this week, I'm going to end with a story. And the story happened to a friend of mine. And it's a kind of story that could be chalked up to coincidence. And yet, to me, I was moved enough to see in it the banner. Now, maybe Christians could do the same thing, so could Muslims. So my faith doesn't depend on this story, but I feel within this story is a banner. Okay, you understand my parameter? That's my parameter. So here's how we go. My friend's name is Rabbi Y.Y. Rubenstein. He is a rabbi from Scotland. And Rabbi Y.Y. Rubenstein had a son named Moshe. Son-in-law. Moshe married his daughter. And one day, Moshe calls up and he says, Dad, calls his father-in-law Dad. He says, I have bad news. I've been having eye difficulties, eye issues. And I went from specialist to specialist. And the prognosis is not good. According to all of them, I will be completely blind in 10 years. I am losing my eyesight. And this is a young man in his 20s. It's a horrible thing to hear. Horrible thing. He happened to be a photographer as well. But even if he wasn't, it's just a horrible thing to hear. What can we do? We daven to Hashem. That's all we can do. A few weeks after this diagnosis was given, this boy Moshe ends up flying to England because he has a photography shoot at a wedding, and then he was going to fly back to Israel, and then last moment, a flight gets canceled. It was a major airline, and he really needed to get back to Israel, so he was trying to find how else can I get back to Israel, and he finds a cut rate airline. So he says, okay, I'm going to take this flight, and because it's so cut rate, it's got the seats are junky and there's no kosher food, and it's just it's a really poor airline. But okay, it's a few hours, and then he's going to be back in Israel. Well, he gets on the flight, and the guy sitting next to him begins to speak with him. Where are you from? Where are you coming from? What happened? Flight got delayed, and then Moshe says, well, I actually studied in a place called Gateshead. Gateshead is a yeshiva in England, in a very poor, sort of workman-like town. Yeah, I studied there. So the man sitting next to him said, oh, that's so interesting. I actually used to study with the rabbi from Gateshead. That rabbi used to come from Gateshead to Newcastle and study with me and a few other groups of young professionals. He would come each week. He would drive from the city of Gateshead to Newcastle to study with me. And Moshe says, who is that rabbi who would study with you? He said, oh, his name was Rabbi Y.Y. Rubenstein. So Moshe says, oh my goodness, that's my father-in-law. He said, your father-in-law studied with me? He said, yeah, for a long time. He would study. He'd go to Newcastle to study. And the man said, it's amazing. Wow, of all people I'm sitting next to, I was next to you. Wow, if you hadn't missed your flight, you wouldn't be sitting here. And as he speaks to him, it turns out the person who was a student of Rabbi Y.Y. Rubenstein is an eye specialist. And I said, "You're an eye specialist. Let me tell you what just happened. I don't know what to do about it, but went to specialist after specialist." And this eye surgeon said, "That's correct. According to modern medicine, you're going to lose your sight, except that I invented a way to tackle this problem, and I can make sure that you don't lose your eyesight. And because your father-in-law was my rabbi, I'm going to personally take care of you, and I'm going to make sure that you get the surgery. And I'm going to do the surgery." And he did the surgery on this young man, and the man had the problem healed, cured, and today he's able to see with no issues at all. Now, could it happen that he just happened to miss his flight? Of all days, today he missed it, and he ended up on a certain flight, and he ended up next to this person, and that person happened to study with his father-in-law, and that person happened to be an eye surgeon, and he happened to just create this. All that stuff could have happened. We don't use that to rely on God to say that, "Oh, there we go. Now that proved to me that God exists." But it is a banner. It is a flag. And if it's a flag, then I could use that to rally around to bolster my faith so that I am able in the future to go about and do my duties as a Jewish person. So let's just review what we spoke about today. We spoke first off about Torah. How do we know the Torah is true? And we said that things need context. Anything that I believe in or that I do, any holiday, if I fast on Yom Kippur, if I put on tefillin, there needs to be context. I need some proof. If I don't have proof, then it doesn't mean much to me. It's too, it's just I'm going through a ritual. Then I said the Torah itself is provable, that what we received, it has fidelity, has accuracy. We said how in other books, and it's not just Christianity, but in other books, there are many, many, many variations which actually change actual meanings. They actually change meanings. And in Judaism, there's a one-letter difference, even though it is 1,300 years older, almost 1,400 years older actually, and even though it is 2/5 larger than the New Testament, still it has that fidelity. We spoke a little bit about the Qumran, how it got that way, where the oldest ones that we know of are. I do want to say that today, all of Torahs have been double-checked against a very special book known as the Keter. There's a special book that is found in the Israel Museum, which became the book that we use. So this way you don't have to carry Torahs around to check Torah versus Torah, but they created a special book. This is all the way, goes back 1,000 years. That's just something interesting to know. And then we spoke about how the Torah itself. How was the Torah given? 10 Commandments, I know. We were at Mount Sinai. But what about the rest of the Torah? We spoke about how that handoff happened through this cloud of glory that God gave to Moshe Rabbeinu, the 10 Commandments together with the Jewish people, but everyone saw that communication, and they knew from then on, whenever the cloud came, that it was God communicating with the Jewish people. And then we spoke about miracles in general. How do we know if a miracle is accurate or not? And then whenever we hear a miracle, we ask ourselves, how many people did it happen to? Was it forewarned, or is it just a coincidence among other coincidences? Did it happen under duress? Did it repeat itself? Did it create obligation? Like, I'm seeing something miraculous. It better have these criteria. Otherwise, it's just something that people say because people want to believe. People want to believe. That's understandable, but that doesn't make it accurate. And then we spoke about the manna being something that literally checks off every one of those boxes. And then we said there are a few more as well. Okay, bye everyone.